Before the bloodshed, before the villages burned, before the forests of New England echoed with the cries of war, there was uneasy peace. The early 1600s brought European settlers to a land that had been home to thriving native nations for thousands of years. The Wampanoag people, led by Chief Massasoit, had lived in harmony with the land long before the English came. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620, they were desperate, starving, and on the brink of death. It was the Wampanoag who kept them alive. Massasoit extended a hand of friendship, teaching them how to grow corn, fish, and survive in a harsh new world. For years, that alliance held, built on fragile trust and mutual need. But peace in colonial America rarely lasted long. As the decades passed, more English settlers arrived, clearing forests, building towns, and fencing land that had once been open hunting grounds. The balance of power slowly shifted. The English multiplied, spreading across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, while native populations declined from disease, displacement, and unequal trade. The Wampanoag, Narragansett, Nipmuc, and other tribes found themselves surrounded, their autonomy shrinking as English law, religion, and culture pushed deeper into their lives. When Massasoit died in 1661, the fragile peace he had maintained began to unravel. His son, Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, succeeded him as the Wampanoag leader. Metacom was no stranger to the colonists. He had grown up among them, traded with them, and understood their ways. But he also saw what they were doing to his people. The English kept demanding more land, more submission, more conformity to their rules. They forced native leaders to sign treaties they couldn't read, imposed taxes, and treated them as subjects, not allies. Metacom's frustration grew as he watched his culture eroded and his people humiliated. Tensions worsened when Christian missionaries began converting native people to Christianity. These converts, called praying Indians, were gathered into separate villages under English supervision. To Metacom and many traditional leaders, this was another form of control, a way to divide and weaken them. Every year, new English towns appeared where Wampanoag villages once stood. The settlers' cattle trampled native cornfields. Colonial courts refused to recognize native rights to land that had been theirs for centuries. By the early 1670s, suspicion ran deep on both sides. The English accused Metacom of plotting a rebellion, while he accused them of betrayal. The spark that finally ignited the war came in 1675 with the murder of a native man named John Sassamon. Sassamon was a Christianized native who had once been close to Metacom but later served as an interpreter and informant for the English. He had warned colonial authorities that Metacom was preparing for war. Shortly after, Sassamon was found dead in a frozen pond. The English were quick to act. As the harsh winter of 1675 turned into the spring of 1676, New England was a land of ashes and fear. Both sides had suffered terribly, but there was no sign of peace. The colonists were exhausted, their towns burned, and their food supplies running low. Yet, despite the heavy losses, their determination to crush Metacom's uprising only grew stronger. They saw the war not only as a military conflict but as a moral one, a struggle between what they viewed as Christian civilization and what they called savage rebellion. For the Native Alliance, the early victories had come at a great cost. Villages that once stood proud and independent were now hiding places in the deep forest. Women and children suffered the most, facing hunger and freezing cold as colonial militias burned their crops and raided their camps. The unity that Metacom had fought to create began to fracture under pressure. Some tribes questioned whether continuing the war was worth the suffering. Others believed surrender meant the total loss of their lands and freedom. Metacom remained resolute. He refused to yield to the English, even as his alliances weakened. He continued to move from camp to camp, rallying warriors, planning ambushes, and seeking supplies. His leadership was marked by persistence and courage, though the odds were turning sharply against him. The colonists, realizing they could not win through conventional battle, began adopting the same tactics the native warriors had mastered: hit-and-run attacks, night raids, and the destruction of food sources. One of the turning points came in early 1676 when the war spread across the Connecticut River Valley. Native warriors attacked the towns of Lancaster, Medfield, and Groton. These assaults were fierce and strategic, designed to strike terror and disrupt English life. In Lancaster, the minister's wife, Mary Rowlandson, was taken captive, a story that later became one of the most famous captivity narratives in American history. Her account, describing her months of living among the native fighters, would shape how future generations viewed the war and its participants. Meanwhile, the English colonies began to coordinate more closely. They shared intelligence, pooled their militias, and offered bounties for native scalps. They also turned to other native groups for help. The Mohegans and Pequots, traditional enemies of the Wampanoag, sided with the English, hoping to secure their own survival by aligning with the powerful colonists. This alliance proved crucial. These native scouts and fighters knew the terrain as well as Metacom's men did, and they helped track and ambush the Wampanoag and their allies. The war's brutality deepened. Entire villages were wiped out, crops burned, and captives sold into slavery. Colonial troops pursued native bands relentlessly through the forests of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The sense of desperation grew on both sides. For many natives, the war had become not just taboo. By the late summer of 1676, New England was barely recognizable. Forests that once stood lush and green were charred and lifeless. Dozens of native villages had vanished, and English towns lay in ashes across the frontier. The war that began as a desperate fight for native survival was now nearing its tragic end. The alliances that had once united the tribes under Metacom were shattered. Some leaders were dead, others captured, and many of the remaining warriors were too weak to fight. Yet, amid the ruins, Metacom still refused to give up. He moved quietly through the forests and swamps around Mount Hope in present-day Rhode Island, his homeland and the symbolic heart of his people. Only a few dozen warriors remained with him. They lived in constant fear of ambush, hunted by English militias and rival native scouts who had joined the colonists. Every path was dangerous, every fire a risk. But Metacom's pride and defiance were unbroken. He would not live as a captive, nor would he abandon the fight to protect the land that had once belonged to his ancestors. The English, determined to end the war once and for all, organized large-scale hunts for Metacom and his remaining followers. They offered bounties for his capture or death, rewards that tempted even former allies. Among those now working with the English was a native man named John Alderman, a Christianized Wampanoag who had once served under Metacom but had turned against him after losing faith in the war's cause. Alderman would soon play a central role in the final act of the conflict. By August 1676, the colonial militias had cornered Metacom's group near Mount Hope. Trapped and surrounded, he faced an impossible choice: surrender and face humiliation or continue fighting to the end. Metacom chose the latter. On August 12, 1676, English soldiers under Captain Benjamin Church launched a surprise attack on his camp. Shots echoed through the swamp. In the chaos, Metacom tried to flee but was struck by a bullet fired by John Alderman. The great leader fell, his life ending in the same land he had fought so fiercely to defend. The English were overjoyed. They saw his death as the triumph of civilization over rebellion. To them, King Philip's death meant the war was finally over. But their victory came with cruelty. Metacom's body was mutilated, his head severed and displayed on a pike in Plymouth for more than 20 years as a grim warning to others. His hand was sent to Boston, and his remains were denied the dignity of a burial. To the colonists, it was justice; to his people, it was desecration. With Metacom's death, organized resistance collapsed almost overnight. The surviving warriors fled north or west, seeking safety among tribes beyond English control. Many were hunted down or sold into slavery. Metacom's wife and young son, captured months earlier, were shipped to the Caribbean as slaves, an act that deeply scarred those who remained. The war, which had lasted just over a year, left